That was sarcasm, by the way, Rita added, helpfully. You know, humor, comedic delivery, laugh track. She looked at the frozen soldiers. Tough crowd. Something cold settled in Vel's chest, right in the space between his primary and secondary hearts. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The physiological mathematics of the situation was simple and clear. One restrained, injured, unarmed prisoner against 6 trained executioners in a secured compound. There was no scenario in which the prisoner should be the most composed entity in the yard. And yet, prisoners facing death begged. They wept. They bargained. They prayed to whatever gods their species kept. They collapsed into themselves in the final moments. They did not make jokes. They did not smile with the tolerant amusement of a parent watching children play at swords. They did not look at trained killers the way this woman was looking at his soldiers, with something that bordered, terrifyingly, on sympathy. Unless, Vel thought, and the thought arrived with the cold, heavy weight of absolute certainty, unless the stories were not stories at all, unless the myths were memories, unless everything his generation had dismissed as exaggeration was, in fact, warning. He raised his hand to give the order, and tried, very hard, to ignore how badly it was trembling. 3 days earlier, Vel had been finishing his morning stimulant and reviewing patrol reports when the alert screamed through every communication channel on the base simultaneously. An unidentified vessel had breached the Fresh 9 defense perimeter. It had not merely crashed. It had carved a burning scar across 15 kilometers of northern wasteland, demolishing 2 sensor towers and a storage depot with what the initial reports described, with bureaucratic understatement, as significant momentum. The ship had finally come to rest in a smoldering crater roughly the diameter of a parade ground, its hull compressed like a stepped-on can of pressurized nutrients. The recovery team found her in the wreckage, unconscious, but alive. The crash site temperatures had been sufficient to liquefy bone. The ship's structural integrity had been entirely compromised. The impact forces recorded by the surviving sensors should have reduced any biological occupant to a smear of organic material across the cockpit wall. Instead, they had pulled Rita Torres from the ruins with concussion, impressive bruising across roughly 40% of her body, and a laceration above her left eye that had sealed itself with apparent indifference to the chaos around it. That should have been Vel's first clue. He recognized that now, in retrospect, with a particular clarity that only hindsight provides. The tribunal hearing had been a formality. Grand Magistrate Kellen, a pompous bureaucrat who wore his ceremonial medals the way other creatures wore body armor, had presided with theatrical gravity. The evidence was, on its surface, damning. No flight plan, no identification codes, no proper authorization, a ship's computer wiped clean, and encrypted data files that Directorate analysts had been unable to crack in 72 hours of continuous effort. Clearly a spy, Kellen had declared, his jowls oscillating with indignation. Dispatched by the Terran Alliance to gather intelligence on our military installations. Rita, seated in the accused chair with her wrists cuffed and one eye swollen nearly shut, had laughed. Not a polite, restrained laugh. A full, genuine, completely unself-conscious laugh that bounced off the high walls of the tribunal chamber and made 3 of Kellen's advisors flinch. "Oh, honey, no," she said, shaking her head with the patient tone of someone correcting a well-meaning but fundamentally mistaken child. "I'm a freight hauler, an independent contractor. I haul medical supplies from the core worlds to outer colony stations. It is profoundly boring work, and I am excellent at it." She paused. "I got caught in a stellar drift current that threw my navigation completely sideways. When I tried to correct course, my jump drive, it's an old Mark 7, very temperamental. You know how they are, hiccuped. Next thing I know, I'm being introduced to your planet the hard way." Kellen's face achieved an impressive new shade of purple. "You expect this tribunal to believe that you accidentally crashed into one of the most heavily defended military systems in the sector." "Accidentally," Rita confirmed, with a grin that seemed entirely unaware of, or entirely unbothered by, the split lip framing it. "Commander, I didn't even know your sector existed until I woke up in your very welcoming accommodations. No offense, but you're not exactly on the major trade routes. This is frontier space. The kind of place you visit if you're lost or desperate or, apparently, if your navigation system decides to have an existential crisis." Vel had watched all of this from his required position by the wall, forbidden to speak, unable to look away. He had found himself fascinated against his will, fascinated and deeply unsettled by a complete, baffling absence of self-preservation instinct. She was insulting the magistrate who controlled whether she lived or died. She was doing it with the casual ease of someone who genuinely did not believe the danger was real. Or, the thought crept in despite his best efforts to suppress it, who genuinely did not believe the danger mattered. The encrypted files, Kellen pressed, refusing to be deflected. Explain those. Personal logs. Vacation photos. Some romance novels I prefer you not read. They in a genre my colleagues would find embarrassing. She shrugged, producing a rattle from the restraints. You want the encryption key? It's my cat's name spelled backward, followed by the number of times my last relationship disappointed me. A beat. Fair warning. It's a very large number. The deliberation lasted 4 minutes. Kellen adjusted his ceremonial sash with practiced gravity and pronounced the death sentence. Rita Torres yawned. Not visibly performed. Not theatrical. A genuine, jaw-wide, eyes-watering yawn of actual fatigue stifled behind her cuffed hands. Yeah, saw that coming, she said, once it had passed. Quick question. Does your system have an appeals process, or is this more of an express lane situation? Something had fractured in Vel's certainty in that moment. Something small but structural, the way a single crack in a foundation wall begins to suggest the possibility of everything above it coming down. This creature, this small, injured thing from the mythical Deathworld, was either the most comprehensively insane being he had ever encountered or the most comprehensively confident. And as he stood in the tribunal chamber watching her being led away, still arguing cordially with her escort about the quality of the cell mattresses, he found that he genuinely could not determine which. Ready the firing squad, Vel commanded, his voice carrying its practiced authority across the silent yard. 6 plasma rifles rose in perfect synchronization. They were not ordinary soldiers. Vel had handpicked each of them personally from the base's elite units. Corporal Thin, with 17 confirmed kills in the border conflicts and the reflexes of a desert predator. Private First Class Jorik, who could place a shot the size of a credit chip at 200 meters on his worst day. Sergeant Cross, who had held the line against rebel forces 3 times his number without breaking stride. The other 3 were equally lethal, equally tested, equally reliable. He had trained with these soldiers. He had watched them maintain perfect discipline under artillery fire that would have broken lesser troops. He had seen them stare down death so many times that it had stopped meaning anything to them. So why were their hands shaking? Then cycle the charge on her rifle for the 3rd time, a nervous habit, completely unnecessary. The weapon had been fully charged since dawn. Jorik kept shifting his weight, adjusting his stance with the restless energy of a first-year cadet on his inaugural posting. Cross, unflappable Cross, who had never once shown fear in Vel's presence, had that purple flush creeping up his neck ridges again, darkening with every heartbeat. They had heard the stories, too. Of course they had. Permission to speak, Commander, Rita called out. Her voice cut through the taut silence with a clarity that suggested she had no intention of waiting for a response either way. Protocol dictated that he refuse. The condemned had no rights of communication once sentence had been passed. Protocol had been Vel's shield and compass for 17 years. He nodded anyway. Could I get some water? She asked, rolling her shoulders against the restraints with the comfortable ease of someone requesting a small convenience. And maybe 30 seconds to stretch? I've been in these cuffs for 3 days, and I have to tell you, my back is absolutely killing me. You know how it is. Cramped spacecraft, bad sleeping arrangements. The whole captured prison experience really does a number on your spine. The request was so mundane, so aggressively ordinary in the context of an active execution, that Vel found himself gesturing to a nearby guard before rational thought could intervene. The guard approached with a canteen held at maximum arm extension, as though the container itself might be dangerous. Rita drank deeply and with genuine, uncomplicated pleasure, water running down her chin, a long sigh of satisfaction escaping when she finally lifted her head. Thanks, big guy. Genuinely appreciate it. She looked back up at Vel, and the stretch? You have 30 seconds. The magnetic restraints disengaged with a low hum. Every soldier in the compound tensed simultaneously, a collective, involuntary flinching, like a single organism reacting to sudden sound. 6 rifles tracked her movement with mechanical precision. Vel's hand moved, without conscious decision, to his sidearm. Rita rolled her neck. The sound it made, a rapid, percussive series of cracks, like someone walking across frozen ground, made Vel's skin crawl in a way he could not have fully explained. She bent forward from the waist and touched her toes with the casual ease of someone who does this every morning, and held the position. Her breathing was slow, controlled, rhythmic, the breathing of someone at complete rest. "I've been watching your firing squad," she said, her voice carrying oddly from her inverted position, head between her knees, "and I'm a little concerned about their form." Vel blinked. Their form. Thin, the one on the left. Rita straightened, rolling her arms above her head in a slow arc. The movement should have read as vulnerability. Instead, it read as a predator preparing. She's favoring her right side. Old injury, compensating in her stance. It's going to pull her shots left. Jorik, second from the right, is gripping his rifle too tightly. He's going to throw high. And Cross. She nodded toward the large sergeant. Cross is breathing too shallow. Adrenaline response. His first shot will be clean, but his follow-through is going to be erratic. The silence that followed was of a quality that Vel had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. Finn's eyes went wide. Jorik looked down at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Cross made a sound that could not be cleanly categorized as either growl or whimper. "How?" Vel started, then had to stop, clear his throat, and begin again. "How could you possibly know any of that?" Rita walked back to the wall with the unhurried ease of someone returning to a seat at a performance. She positioned herself against it, clicked the restraints back into place herself, and tested them once, a deliberate, assessing pull, before nodding as though she had confirmed something useful. "Where I come from," she said, and now her voice had shifted. Quieter, stripped of the playful edge, carrying something underneath that made Vel's primary heartbeat harder. "We learn to read bodies before we learn to read language. You watch how people move. You learn how they are going to act before they decided to act. It's a survival skill." She paused. Useful in freight negotiations. Also useful in situations like this. She looked up at him with those flat, unreadable brown eyes. "Just so we're all clear, Commander. You're about to order 6 terrified soldiers to shoot at someone who has already identified 17 different ways this ends badly for you. Not for me. For you." Vel felt his primary heart hammering against his ribs. "You are restrained. You are unarmed. You are one against 6 trained killers." "Sure," she agreed, with a kind of terrible cheerfulness. "And you know what's funny about that? I'm still not scared." Her gaze moved across the firing squad. "But they are. Look at them, Commander. Really look. They've heard the stories. The Deathworld stories. The ones about humans who don't know when to quit, who treat pain as an inconvenience rather than a warning, who will keep moving through things that should stop them because stopping was never really an option on the world that made them." "Stories," Vel said. The word came out smaller than he intended. Rita held his gaze for a long, unhurried moment. "Stories," she agreed softly, and somehow, the way she said it, with neither confirmation nor denial, just a quiet, knowing patience, was the most frightening thing Vel had ever heard in 17 years of warfare. He raised his hand. His fingers were steady now, because he had made his decision, and the trembling belonged to doubt, and he had run out of room for doubt. "Firing squad," he called out, his voice barely holding its shape. "Take aim." 6 plasma rifles rose. Rita Torres closed her eyes, took a single, slow breath, and smiled, not the amused, performative smile of the past 3 days, but something quieter, something almost tender, the expression of a creature that has already accepted every possible outcome and made peace with all of them. "Whenever you're ready," she said. Vel's hand dropped. "Fire." 6 plasma rifles discharged as one. The sound was extraordinary, not the prolonged roar of a battlefield volley, but a single crystalline crack, as though the air itself had been split open and immediately slammed shut. 6 lines of brilliant blue-white energy screamed across the execution yard in perfect convergence. Aim at the center of the small figure against the carbon wall. The wall exploded. Metal ran like water where 6 superheated bolts struck simultaneously, the carbon-reinforced surface glowing white-hot, heat shimmers warping the air above it in wild, desperate patterns. Rita Torres was 3 meters to the left. Vel's mind refused the information for 2 full seconds, a grinding, mechanical refusal, like gears stripped of their teeth and spinning uselessly. His eyes told him one thing. The laws of physics told him it was impossible. One of those 2 sources of information was catastrophically wrong. The magnetic restraints hung open and empty, the locking mechanism somehow, impossibly, disengaged. She had moved between the command and the impact, in less than the space of a single heartbeat. She had not stepped aside. She had not lunged. She had detonated into motion in a way that bypassed every ordinary definition of fast and arrived somewhere else entirely. Hi! Rita examined her wrist with a mild interest of someone checking a recent purchase. Those locks are actually not that complicated once you understand the magnetic pulse sequence. I had 3 days. She looked up at him. Thanks for the time. By the way, very generous of you. Reload and fire again. Vel's voice cracked down the middle. Now! Training overrode terror. Rifles cycled. Thin fired first. A snapshot, aimed at center mass, professional and fast. Rita leaned back exactly far enough. The bolt passed so close to her face that Vel could see her hair lift in the superheated air. She did not flinch. She did not blink. She watched the bolt pass with the expression of someone watching a ball thrown slightly wide of the mark. Jorik and Cross fired together, attempting to bracket her position, to close off the space on either side. Rita dropped into a role that had no business being possible from someone who had spent 3 days in restraints. Fluid, clean, explosively fast. Coming up in a crouch as both shots scorched the air above her in twin lines of burning blue. "Is that your best?" she called out, and there was laughter in her voice, genuine, unforced amusement. "Because back home we play a game called paintball. The balls curve in flight. This is considerably less challenging." The remaining 3 soldiers opened fire in a ragged volley, panic dissolving their coordination into noise. Rita moved between the shots the way water moves between rocks in a current, not fighting the geometry but flowing through its gaps, as though she could see the bolts before they left the barrels, as though the space between moments was something she had learned to navigate long before today. Then she was no longer at the wall. She was among them. Private Jorik, to his credit, attempted to bring his rifle around for a point-blank shot. Rita's hand, small, pale, apparently fragile, shot out and caught the barrel. The sound the metal made as she bent it skyward was something Vel felt in his back teeth. The rifle discharged into empty air. Her other hand came up in a palm strike to Jorik's chestplate, and the soldier, 80 kilograms of armored, combat-trained Corvathi, flew backward as though he had stepped in front of a cargo transport. He landed 5 meters away with his armor cracked, fighting desperately for breath. "Sorry about that," Rita said, sounding not particularly sorry at all. "You were pointing it at my face. I'm somewhat attached to my face." Thin dropped her damaged rifle and went for her sidearm. A smart, adaptive response, exactly the kind of tactical flexibility Vel had spent years training into her. Rita was faster. She closed the distance before the weapon cleared its holster, caught Thin's wrist, and did something precise and controlled with her grip that made the veteran soldier cry out and release the weapon instantly. Rita caught the sidearm before it hit the ground, ejected the charge pack in the same motion, and tossed both pieces in opposite directions with the easy efficiency of someone who has done this enough times that it requires no thought. "Good instinct," she said, and she meant it, her voice carrying genuine respect. "Switching weapons under pressure. That's real training. Well done." Cross roared. The sound was pure, undiluted rage, the howl of a creature that has swallowed its fear whole and converted every gram of it to forward momentum. He charged with everything he had, 210 kilograms of armored Corvathi soldier at full sprint, forearms spread wide to wrap around her and end this. It should have worked. Against any reasonable opponent, it would have worked. Rita waited. She waited until the last mathematically possible instant, until Cross was fully committed to his trajectory, until the mass of momentum behind him made changing course physically impossible, and then she dropped flat to the ground. Cross sailed over her and hit the execution wall with an impact that shook the compound to its foundations, denting carbon-reinforced metal with the force of his body. Before he could recover, before the shock had even finished traveling through his bones, Rita was on his back, one arm locked around his neck in a hold that looked, almost paradoxically, gentle. "Easy now," she said quietly, into the shell of his ear. "Easy. This is going to be fine. I just need you to stop for a second." Cross-fought, powerful, desperate, technically precise attempt to break the hold, and she rode every one of them with the patient ease of someone who has trained this 10,000 times and knows exactly how it ends. 3 seconds. Then his eyes rolled back, his enormous body going slack, and she lowered him to the ground with care that was, in the context of everything happening around her, genuinely startling. She held him there for a moment, making sure he was positioned safely on his side, then patted his armored shoulder. "You did everything right," she said softly to his unconscious form. "Every single thing. This was never a fair fight. That's not on you." She stood. Around her, 5 of the 6 soldiers of Vel's elite firing squad lay scattered across the execution yard like wreckage from a collision. Jorik gasping but alive. Then sitting up, flexing her wrist with a wince, watching Rita with an expression that had moved somewhere beyond fear into something closer to awe. Cross unconscious but breathing steadily, settled carefully on his side. The 3 remaining soldiers had backed to the far wall, rifles raised, hands shaking badly enough to be visible from the observation platform 20 meters above. Rita stood in the center of the execution yard. She was not breathing hard. A light sheen of perspiration caught the twin sunlight on her forehead. Nothing more. She might have been returning from a casual walk through a market district. She looked up at Vel. "So," she said, and her voice held no triumph, no cruelty, nothing but a bone-deep, weary practicality. "Are we done here? Or would you like to send more people to the medical bay? Because I want to be very clear. I can do this all day. I once stayed awake for 72 consecutive hours loading cargo containers in 1.4 standard gravity. I am nowhere near my limit. I am barely inconvenienced." Vel could not move, could not speak, could not think beyond the single, repeating, relentless certainty hammering through both his hearts like a war drum that would not stop. The stories were true. Every whispered tale, every dismissed myth, every piece of so-called propaganda he had laughed at in the barracks, all of it was true, and it was standing in his execution yard, mildly out of breath, surrounded by his unconscious elite soldiers, looking at him with patient brown eyes and waiting. This was what a human could do. This small, injured, battered creature had dismantled his finest firing squad in under 2 minutes while providing what amounted to professional commentary, and she had pulled every strike. He could see it now, the controlled force, the deliberate precision, the careful application of exactly as much as was needed and not one single unit more. She had not been trying to win. She had been trying to demonstrate. She had been giving him a lesson, and she had been as gentle about it as a lesson allowed. She could have killed them all. "What are you?" Vel whispered. The question came out raw, stripped of rank and certainty. Rita tilted her head, considered the question with the same thoughtful patience she brought to everything. "Annoyed, mostly," she said. "I was having a perfectly decent week before your defense grid decided my ship looked interesting. I had a schedule, deliveries, people on colony stations counting on me." She looked at the ruined wall where 6 plasma bolts had melted metal to slag. "Now I'm 3 days behind, and my ship is probably unsalvageable. So yeah, annoyed." She lowered her hands and began walking toward the observation platform. Not rushing, not threatening, just walking, with the calm, unhurried confidence of someone who has decided the meeting is over and is heading for the exit. "How about we have a real conversation now, Commander? One where you stop trying to kill me, and I stop embarrassing your military. I think we'd both prefer it." Vel descended from the observation platform on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. His sidearm was in his hand. He was not entirely certain when that had happened. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at the soldiers on the ground, then put it away. What was the point? They sat across from each other on the ground of the execution yard, the commander of Fresh Nine's most secure military installation, and a freight hauler from a backwater Yellow Star system, while groaning soldiers recovered around them, and the twin suns beat down without comment. "I told you the truth at the tribunal," Rita said. "Every word. I'm a freight hauler, independent contractor, 7 years running medical supplies to outer colonies. It is quiet work, and I like it that way. Navigation error, failed jump drive, wrong place, very wrong time. She picked up a small chunk of stone from the cracked ground and turned it over in her fingers. You shot down a delivery driver. Commander, somewhere out there right now, a colony is waiting on insulin and anti-rejection medication that was supposed to arrive 4 days ago. Vel watched her squeeze the rock. Casually, without apparent effort, it crumbled to powder in her palm. She let the dust sift through her fingers and fall to the ground like gray sand. Here's what you need to understand, she said quietly. Humans come from a planet that has spent every single day of our evolutionary history trying to kill us. Not metaphorically, literally, where the systems that can freeze you solid or cook you alive within the same afternoon. Pack-hunting predators with enough intelligence to set deliberate ambushes. Plants that are poisonous. Insects that carry diseases specifically calibrated to exploit our biology. Bacteria that evolve faster than we can manufacture responses to them. She dusted the last of the stone from her hands. Our gravity is apparently around 30% higher than the Corvathi comfortable range. We just never notice because we grew up in it. We didn't know it was remarkable. It was just Tuesday. We adapted, she continued. Over millions of years, we adapted to everything our world threw at us. We got very, very good at not dying. And then, when we finally ran out of things on our own planet trying to kill us, we went looking for more. Vel felt the cold thing in his stomach settle deeper, spreading outward. How good. I'm not special, Rita said, and her voice was level, uninflected, carrying the particular weight of plain facts spoken by someone who has no reason to exaggerate. Back home, I am average. Slightly above average because freight work keeps you physically capable. But that's it. There are humans who run 160-kilometer races through active deserts. For fun, voluntarily, because they enjoy it. There are humans who climb mountains where the air is so thin that their blood begins breaking down, and they climb them anyway because the view is worth it. There are humans who voluntarily leap from aircraft at altitude with nothing but fabric to slow their fall because the sensation gives them pleasure. She leaned forward slightly, and Vel fought the deep, instinctive urge to lean back. We have athletes who can sustain speeds your military transport vehicles struggle to match over short distances. We have soldiers, regular, baseline, completely unaugmented soldiers, who train in conditions that would hospitalize your best troops within 48 hours. We have people who have survived things that should have killed them by every applicable physical law, and whose primary response was to be mildly annoyed about the inconvenience. A pause. One of our historical figures survived being shot in the chest before giving a 90-minute speech. He mentioned the gunshot wound at the beginning, and then he kept going, because he had a speech to give. She met his eyes, and here is the part that should genuinely concern you. We haven't been in the galactic community long enough to fully understand what we can do out here, where the gravity is lighter and the threats are different. We're still figuring it out. We're still discovering what we become when the conditions change. What I just demonstrated in your execution yard. Her voice was quiet now. Final. That was me. Injured. Dehydrated. Sleep-deprived. 3 days in restraints. Operating at somewhere around 60% of my normal capacity. The words hit Vel like a physical impact, somewhere behind both eyes at once. 60%, he repeated. 60%, she confirmed. And I was being careful the entire time, pulling every strike, choosing the options that kept everyone conscious and breathing. Because I didn't want to hurt your people, Commander. I want to make that absolutely clear. Not because I couldn't, because I chose not to. They were following orders. They were doing their jobs. This wasn't their fault, and they deserved better than what I was required to do. Vel looked at Cross, still unconscious, still breathing, still positioned carefully on his side because she had made sure of it before walking away from him. He looked at Jorik, testing his cracked breastplate with careful fingers. He looked at Thin, who was watching Rita with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of a fundamental concept has just been quietly, permanently revised. "What do you want?" he asked. He was no longer Commander Vel conducting a security interrogation. He was a creature confronting something larger and more complex than anything in 17 years of military experience had prepared him to understand. "What I've wanted from the very beginning," Rita said simply. Let me repair my ship. Give me access to the crash site. Let me salvage what I need. Don't interfere. I'll leave your planet. I'll file a diplomatic complaint about your defense grid's trigger-happy tendencies, which, to be completely frank, represent a serious liability you should address before you do this to someone less inclined toward patience, and we can all move forward. You go back to running your base. I go back to my route. The colony gets its medication. Everyone wins. And if I refuse? Rita's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, the way a body of deep water changes when the light goes out above it, becoming flat and very still and impossible to read. Then I stop being polite, she said. I take what I need. I leave anyway. And a significantly larger number of your soldiers spend time in medical facilities. I don't want that, Commander. A pause that carried weight. I genuinely don't want that. But I have a delivery to make, and I am going to make it. That is not negotiable. The only variable is how many people get hurt before I do. Vel sat in the execution yard of his own compound, surrounded by his scattered elite soldiers and the debris of everything he thought he understood about the universe, and looked at the small human woman across from him. He thought about his duty. He thought about his orders. He thought about 17 years of absolute certainty. He thought about her carefully placing Cross on his side. Take what you need, he said. Repair your ship. Leave. Rita's face broke into a real smile, not the practiced, calibrated performance of the past 3 days, but something genuine and warm and deeply tired. The smile of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally been permitted to stop. Thank you, she said, and she meant it completely. That is the smart call. That is genuinely and unambiguously the smart call, and I want you to know I recognize that. She stood and extended her hand. Vel stared at it for a long moment, at those small, pale, apparently fragile fingers that had bent dough steel and sent armored soldiers flying through the air with casual, controlled precision. Then, slowly, he reached out with one of his own. Her grip was firm but measured, not crushing, not demonstrating anything. A handshake between two beings who had tested each other honestly and arrived, unexpectedly, at mutual respect. One more thing, Rita said, turning to leave. The encrypted files your tribunal was so worked up about. They really were just personal records. But I'll delete everything before I go. No record of your planet, your installations, your defenses, your people. Clean slate. She paused. You have my word. She walked across the scorched execution yard toward the gate. At the threshold, she paused once, briefly, almost imperceptibly, and looked back at Cross, still unconscious, still breathing steadily. Something moved across her face that was difficult to name. Then she was gone, and the gate was just a gate again, and the yard was just a yard, and the scorch marks on the wall were already cooling from white-hot to dull gray in the desert air. His calm unit chirped 10 minutes later. Commander! Grand Magistrate Kellen's voice, compressed with self-importance. Has the execution been carried out? Report immediately. Vel looked at the execution wall. He looked at the yard being carefully, quietly cleared of groaning soldiers by medics who kept glancing toward the gate. He looked at the empty space where Rita Torres had stood and unmade everything. The prisoner has been released. Magistrate, he said flatly, I am filing an emergency classification update, effective immediately. Earth designation is being upgraded from minimal threat to critical, system-wide alert level. I am recommending that all future encounters with human vessel be treated as first-contact diplomatic situations, not hostile engagements, under any circumstances. I am further recommending immediate distribution of this recommendation to every command post in the sector. Vel, you absolutely cannot. This is completely irregular. You will explain yourself this instant. He cut the connection. 2 days later, he stood on the observation platform again and watched Rita's ship lift off. It was an extraordinary thing to behold. Battered, patched, held together with salvaged components and what Vel could only describe as the structural equivalent of sheer, unreasonable determination. Scorch marks layered over older scorch marks. Components from 3 different generations of spacecraft had been jury-rigged into an arrangement that, by every engineering principle Vel understood, should not have been capable of achieving atmospheric escape. It climbed into the sky, trailing sparks and the occasional alarming mechanical protest, banked once in a wide, unhurried arc, as though it were taking a final look, or saying something it lacked the words for, and then vanished into the upper atmosphere, gone as cleanly and completely as if it had never been there at all. Vel watched the contrail fade until there was nothing left to watch. Then he activated his personal log, something he had not done in years, something he had always privately considered an indulgence of commanders with too much sentiment and too much time. Note to future commanders, he said quietly, into the recorder, into the empty air above the empty yard. The humans are real. Everything you've heard is real. They are not myth, not propaganda, not the exaggerations of soldiers who saw too much combat and started inventing monsters. They are warnings dressed up as stories, passed down because the people who survived encounters with them wanted someone, somewhere, to be better prepared than they were. He paused. I watched one of them absorb an execution order, escape from magnetic restraint she had been quietly studying for 3 days, dismantle 6 of our finest soldiers in under 2 minutes, and then sit down on the ground of our execution yard and offer us a reasonable, equitable solution. Because, she explained, she didn't want to hurt anyone. She expressed genuine regret about the soldiers she'd had to incapacitate. She made sure the last one she put down was positioned safely before she walked away from him. He stopped. She was operating at 60% capacity. She was a freight hauler. She was, by her own account, average. The desert wind moved through the empty compound. Somewhere below, he could hear Cross's voice asking a medic about his equipment. Awake, recovered, apparently no worse of the experience beyond a bruised ego and a permanently revised understanding of the universe. If you encounter a human vessel, Vel continued, do not threaten them. Do not imprison them. Do not attempt to execute them under any circumstances. Talk to them. Listen to them with the full attention you would bring to a briefing that determines the fate of your command. Treat them with the respect and careful consideration you would show a natural disaster, because that is precisely what they are, beautiful, terrifying, deeply improbable forces of nature who happen to be capable of making conversation and expressing genuine concern for your well-being while they are in the process of rearranging everything you thought you knew about the world. A final pause. The contrail was gone entirely now. Nothing remained of Rita Torres and her impossible, stubborn, jury-rigged ship except the silence she had left behind and the scorch marks on the wall. And if you are very, very lucky, he said softly, they will be as merciful as she was. He closed the log and walked back toward his office, already drafting a report that would rewrite Corvathi military doctrine for the next generation and every generation after that. Behind him, the execution yard sat empty beneath 2 suns. The scorch marks on the wall held a light and kept it permanent, precise, the exact geometry of 6 plasma bolts that had struck where a human woman had been standing half a heartbeat before they arrived. A monument to the day everything changed. The day they finally understood that some stories are not told to entertain. They are told so that the people who hear them might survive the same mistake. Commander Vel had overseen executions before, more than he cared to count. In his 17 years of service to the Corvathi Military Directorate, he had stood at attention while plasma fire reduced condemned prisoners to ash, had read the official declarations in a flat, practiced voice, and had returned to his quarters afterward without so much as a troubled dream. Death was a tool, an instrument of order. He had long since made peace with that. But as he stood on the observation platform overlooking the execution yard that morning, his forearms clasped behind his back in what he desperately hoped looked like military composure, something felt profoundly, inescapably wrong. Below him, the firing squad, 6 of his finest soldiers, stood at rigid attention, their plasma rifles gleaming beneath the harsh dual suns of Fresh 9. The heat shimmer rising from the compound's reinforced metallic floor made the scene ripple like a fever dream, bending the world into something slightly unreal. The sky above was the color of old copper. Somewhere beyond perimeter walls, a desert wind dragged itself across the wasteland and died. Then the prisoner was brought out. Vel's secondary heart skipped a beat, an involuntary, embarrassing lurch that he hoped no one noticed. She was small, laughably, almost offensively small, perhaps half his height, with pale skin so thin it looked like it might tear if you breathed on it too hard. Her dark hair was matted with dried blood, hanging over her face in tangled, defeated strands. The dirty steel restraints, heavy-gauge cuffs engineered to contain the most violent Corvathi criminals, looked preposterously oversized on her slender wrists, as if someone had attempted to shackle a juvenile grub with industrial chains. She wore the scorched, shredded remnants of what had once been a flight suit, the fabric burned and frayed from the crash. A human, an actual, breathing, undeniable human. Until 3 days ago, Vel had been almost certain they were myth. Oh, there were stories, whispered tales that circulated through the barracks after too many cups of fermented kelp, told by old soldiers with hollow eyes and voices that dropped to near silence. Stories about the bipedal terrors from the third planet of a backwater yellow star system. Stories about creatures who evolved on a world so brutally, comprehensively hostile to life that the mere act of surviving there forged them into something extraordinary. Something dangerous. Something that defied every rational principle of biology. Stories about their pain tolerance. Their stubbornness. Their refusal to accept death as anything more than a strongly worded suggestion. Vel had laughed at those stories. He had called them propaganda, exaggerations crafted to rattle new recruits, ghost tales invented by soldiers who had seen too much combat and started seeing monsters in the shadows. He was a practical creature. He dealt in evidence, in data, in the cold arithmetic of military logic. He was not laughing now. The 2 guards escorting the prisoner to the execution post were Corvathi veterans, massive, battle-hardened soldiers who had served through the grinding violence of the Outer Rim conflicts. Sergeant Cross, the larger of the 2, had personally neutralized a fortified rebel stronghold in single combat during the last rotation. He had done it without hesitation, without fear. That same Cross was now holding the humans on the way someone handles a live thermal detonator, carefully, at maximum distance, with the taut muscles of a creature that had decided fleeing might be preferable to touching. The purple flush of anxiety was spreading visibly across both guards' neck ridges. Vel could hear the faint tremor in their breathing from 20 meters away. They were afraid of her, of this small, injured, restrained woman who, by every observable metric, should not have been able to hurt a juvenile grub, let alone 2 armored soldiers who had survived things that would break lesser beings. The woman, Rita Torres, according to the tribunal records, was positioned against the carbon-reinforced execution wall. The restraints clicked into the magnetic locks with a sound that echoed sharply across the silent compound. She should have been trembling. She should have been weeping, begging, bargaining, doing all the desperate, pit-table things that condemned prisoners invariably did when they finally understood that the end had arrived. Instead, she lifted her head and smiled. Not the nervous, fractured smile of someone trying to mask terror. Not the desperate grin of a creature clutching at bravado like a life raft. It was a smile of genuine, relaxed amusement, the expression of someone who found the entire situation mildly entertaining, the way one might smile at a particularly clumsy comedy performance. Her eyes, an unsettling shade of brown that seemed to catch and hold a light in a way that made Vel's skin prickle, moved slowly, methodically over the firing squad below her, not with a frantic, pleading scan of the condemned, with a calm, professional assessment of someone cataloging information. Then those eyes found Vel on the observation platform, and stayed there. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds before he was the one who looked away. "Rita Torres of Earth," Vel announced, his voice amplified by the platform speaker system, carrying the flat, ceremonial weight of 43 previous death sentences. "You have been found guilty by the Corvathi Military Tribunal of an authorized intrusion into restricted sovereign space, espionage against the Directorate, and violation of the Colonial Protection Act. The sentence is death by firing squad, to be carried out immediately." He paused, as he always did. "Do you have any final words?" Rita Torres tilted her head, actually tilted it, with a thoughtful, unhurried air of someone pondering a mildly interesting philosophical question, and appeared to genuinely consider the inquiry. "Yeah, actually," she said. Her voice was raspy, rough with dehydration, but utterly, disconcertingly steady. "I've got a question for your firing squad." She looked down at the 6 armed soldiers. "Could you guys maybe aim a little faster? I've got places to be, deliveries to make. I was really hoping we could move this along." The silence that followed was absolute. Vel's translator implant flickered with a brief processing error, as though it had momentarily concluded that what it had just heard could not possibly be correct, and had decided to double-check. Had she just asked them to execute her more efficiently? Private Paxel, the youngest member of the firing squad, barely 2 cycles out of the academy, actually lowered his rifle a few degrees, his face a portrait of pure, unguarded confusion.